morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Wherever you're joining us from, we've got people from across the globe dialing into this, so it's good to have you all here. I'm Thomas Neeson, I'm Managing Partner at Cundall, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to our new series of webinars where we can learn together and share ideas on how we can positively influence the built environment in which we work and live in. I say we've got up to 300 people going to join this call, so it's great to see so many people interested in today's topic. How's everybody doing? Mostly probably sitting at home if you're on the western side of the world. We've got some special speakers here today from Australia who will be happy to talk to you about this subject, and also will be very happy to talk to you about what it's like to work in an office or to go for a drink after work and things like that. So if you really want to get upset, she'll be happy to help you with that. When we started doing these webinars pretty much a year ago, we thought this would be like maybe a 3-month program. We didn't have any idea we'd be getting into series 4 a year down the line, but we got what we've got. We've got to work with it, and we've got to make use of our time and use it to the best advantage to educate and inform ourselves, because COVID will pass and there'll be plenty to do, and there already is plenty to do in the world going forward in addressing the climate emergency we've got. So I say we've got 2 colleagues from Australia, 2 from the UK that are going to take you through our talk today. Jen and Richard are in the UK. We've sent out their profiles with the invite, so you can read up on their background. David and Nick are in Australia, and they don't very often dress in a suit and tie and formal shirt. That's not really the way it goes out there, and not today either. And I guess everybody's dressed down a bit. But why are we here? We know that collectively we've got to reduce our impact we're having on the planet. We're going to consume less if we're ever going to get close to limiting the temperature rise to what we've set out in the Paris Agreement. There are lots and lots of different areas of this, things we can do. And today we're talking about NABERS, which we're importing and improving from the UK. And the point of this is that if we're going to reduce our impact, what are we reducing from? We need data and targets that are meaningful in this. And in the UK, EPCs and even DECs are useful, but not that scientific and are not where we need to be. NABERS will improve on that, and that's what we're going to talk to you about today. We've been delivering this in Australia since we set up our Australian business in 2002. So the team there have got plenty of experience. They've shared that with us so that we can develop a protocol for the UK that will work and hopefully go into the wider world. So that's what we're talking about, getting identifying the gap between efficient design, performance, operation, and impact, and how we join that together. So it's a very packed agenda. We've got 4 speakers who all want to educate you on what I'm able to do. So I won't keep you any longer. Please ask questions and join in as we go along. That way we all learn something together. Sign up for all the talks that are coming after this, and we'll be posting them all on our YouTube channel, so you can go back and look at any of the talks we've done at your leisure, or you can share them with your colleagues. So get involved, join in, and please enjoy the webinar. I'll hand you over to Jen to take us through. Thank you, Jen.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Thomas. And, as an Australian working in London now, it's so exciting to be over here to see the scheme finally launched in the UK and really bring across those learnings. And, sort of before we start with the real content of the webinar, I wanted to sort of put in something that's a little bit positive, given where we are coming out of February and hopefully into a better spring. I wanted to start with a good news story. So what we've got here on the vertical axis is landlord operational energy intensity in kilowatt hours per metre squared net per year. Now, what we're looking at here is the average of all data we have for buildings in London in 2012 and then 2018. What we can see is that there's already a 5% saving between 2012 and 2018 in that 6-year period. Now, we compare that to Melbourne. Now, in 2002, Melbourne is about where London was in 2012. Energy intensity for the landlord of about 160 metres squared net per metre squared per year. You compare that to 2019. Now, what I've done here is taken the data from the currently available NABERS ratings. And as we'll talk about in the webinar coming up, NABERS ratings are mandatory for all buildings in Australia. And Melbourne, obviously, no exception. So when we talk about the average of all ratings in Melbourne for 2019, this isn't just the top 5 rated buildings or 3 new buildings. This is every building, existing buildings, new buildings, across 90 ratings in Melbourne. That represents a 40% saving in 2019 compared to 2002. And having worked in both Australia and the UK, I really observed that that's a market transformation at all levels. It's designers upskilling to be able to design buildings that operate better. It's contractors constructing and handing over buildings that are able to be operated efficiently. And then it's also upskilling in on-site teams, facilities teams, customer teams, understanding what makes for efficient operation and really implementing that in buildings on a day-to-day basis. And it's this market transformation that NABERS has effected in Australia, and what we want to really see that happen in the UK.
I think I'll just jump in there, Jen, just to point out that it was actually the market in Australia that sort of moved first. So even though NABERS is largely mandatory here now, those first couple of years, the market moved on it because it was quickly recognised that it wasn't a particularly expensive scheme to be a part of, and it used existing data that was already there that we had for our building, so it was able to sort of be implemented quite easily. And the progress from that 2002 to 2019 really was driven by recognising that slight improvements on rating performance was what was expected, as opposed to achieving perfection straight away. So we weren't jumping in and targeting the highest ratings. We were just rating our buildings year on year and recognising that a little bit of progress towards a better result was a great thing, and people were sharing that. So I think that was the key learning for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what we really want to share, those learnings today from Australia and from the UK. Talking about, to start with, well, what is NABERS UK, and then going into the process, how it works for new buildings and how it works for existing and operational buildings. What it's going to mean for the UK in the future years coming. And then a couple of case studies, just talking about the scheme in action from the UK perspective as well as from the Australian perspective. But really we want to make sure that the focus of today is what steps can we all on this webinar take today to get ready for the scheme. So to start off with, what is NABERS UK? So NABERS is a 6-star rating scheme. 3-star is set as the benchmark energy consumption for that location. You'd get a higher rating, up to 6 stars, if you use less energy than that average. You would get a lower rating, a 1-star or poor rating, if you're using more energy than that average. And the important thing here to realise is that this is an annual rating, and it's based on the energy that you actually used in that period. So you'd submit your utility bills, any sub-metering data on an annual basis. But what that means is that in comparison to some of the other rating schemes out there, you don't need to have particular building inclusions included within the building to get that higher star rating. You can save energy by, of course, implementing, top of the line chillers, but equally and as important within the scheme is really tuning up the controls on site, making sure that run times are reduced as much as possible. And by having that performance-based rating outcome, it doesn't matter what you've got in the building. What matters is how much energy you save. Obviously, for new buildings where you don't have a year's worth of performance data yet, or the building's under design, there's a pre-performance sort of process, the design for performance process. And this process, we've heard a lot about this over the previous years. And the process involves committing to a NABERS Energy Star rating, doing a detailed simulation model showing how that building is going to operate and demonstrating that that building can achieve the star rating that's been targeted. That simulation is then reviewed by a specialist independent design reviewer to really give that third-party verification that the design and the simulation demonstrate the design is going to achieve that rating target. Once that process is completed and the building goes into construction, you're able to promote that NABERS rating to, for example, prospective tenants through the leasing process ahead of the asset being constructed and operating. For the focus of today's webinar, we really want to put on the NABERS rating in operation. Obviously, the design process is, a year, a couple of years, but then that asset operates for another 40 to 60 years. The NABERS rating allows performance to be tracked every year for the lifetime of that asset. And as I say, the way that the scheme works is that you might sort of start out with your first rating, and typically, maybe if you're an existing building, you might only be getting a 2-star rating. you undertake some controls, upgrades and improvements, really reducing those time schedules, you might get a 3-star rating. Then might, end of life of your chillers, you might be able to upgrade to more efficient plant, get a much higher star rating. And I'd say that this annual process and this continual improvement process is really the strength of the NABERS UK tool. It validates the performance of building upgrades and improvements, and it signals to the market a commitment to building performance, as well as demonstrating that performance to your tenants. But the other thing to emphasise here is that it really creates a positive culture around improving energy performance. When your on-site teams can see that they implement a saving and they get a higher star rating, that really encourages a really positive performance-focused culture within the building. At the same time, by having that market signal pointing out to the building towards the market, you're able to unlock a lot of those upstream funding for upgrades, for capital improvement projects that can then help start unlocking even higher and higher ratings for the building.
So just to talk a little bit about the, I guess, the recognised value of NABERS in Australia. So based on, I guess, real data from our industry over here, with a higher rated NABERS rating building, it's quite often you'll see longer term leases with more premium tenants sort of seeking out those buildings. So yeah, the length of leases and the commitments of leases are greater for higher rated buildings. Also, there's a significantly lower vacancy rate with those higher rated buildings as well. So there's a reason to target the NABERS ratings of sort of 4 to 6 stars to sort of attract those tenants that do want to have those longer leases, and those tenants are seeking out those sorts of buildings. So there's lower vacancy rates, and also there's a higher asset value attributed to the higher rated buildings. So it's definitely this has been published in a number of ways over the years down here, and it's very clear to our market that there's the significant benefits associated with achieving a higher NABERS rating. So in terms of the timeline in Australia for NABERS, so it was in the late 90s that it first actually was released. It was the Australian Building Greenhouse Rating System back then, ABGR. So it's now the National Australian Built Environment Rating System, which is NABERS. So it wasn't until about 2006 that it actually started getting written into things over here. So we have the Property Council of Australia's Guide to Office Building Quality. So for an A-grade office building and a premium grade office building, it was then written in that you needed to achieve each year a 5-star minimum NABERS energy rating. So that was then like 2006 where we started actually referring to that as, well, you're not A-grade office or you're not premium grade office unless you have at least 5-star NABERS. But it's important to recognise that before then the market was already moving and we were already rating a lot of existing buildings and new buildings, just to kind of understand where buildings were performing at and how, what was required to increase the star rating. So again, it's the progress as opposed to perfection that was the initial key. In 2010, this was a big one for us. There was two significant events. Firstly, it was government tenants released a policy where they actually wouldn't lease a building or lease space in a building with a rating less than 4.5 stars. So governments in Australia are significant tenants for commercial building owners. So that the key tenant really for a lot of commercial building owners. So that 4.5-star minimum requirement, or they wouldn't lease the building, was key. And then also mandatory disclosure for office buildings. So they call it commercial building disclosure. Every building with a floor area of 2,000 square metres or greater that's either being sold or being leased has to disclose a NABERS rating at the point of sale or lease. So that essentially mandates NABERS for all office buildings. So that came about just over 10 years after the scheme was first released. 2017, so that threshold for mandatory disclosure, commercial building disclosure, got dropped to 1,000 square metres. So really the scope of buildings being rated significantly increased. So that's 1,000 square metres are being either sold or leased. And just the year past, we've actually now got I guess our definition of net zero carbon. To achieve a net zero carbon certified rating in Australia, you need a 4-star NABERS energy minimum. So I'll just pass you to Richard to talk about the UK timeline.
Thanks, Nick. So that's what we've seen in Australia. In the UK, we have been slightly behind on this agenda. We've been talking about operational ratings for a long time. But it took quite a while to realise that actually what was going on in Australia around NABERS was positive in terms of dividing up landlord and energy, landlord and tenant energy use. Now, there have been a few initiatives which looked at that, but it took until 2014 for the BBP to initiate the landlord energy rating scheme, which was looking at trying to develop a landlord deck, basically trying to copy a lot of what NABERS was attempting to achieve. Now, that never really got a huge amount of momentum behind it, but a couple of years later in 2016, Design for Performance kicked off. As Jen has been talking about, this is looking specifically at new buildings and major refurbishments, and is looking about that commitment agreement process, about trying to start the process. And just last year, then we've had the launch of the NABERS UK scheme fully, which is about trying to roll out the rating systems which sit with the design for performance process for new construction. Obviously, this rating system will be for all buildings or all office buildings, new and existing. We've also seen a significant number of moves around how NABERS is getting referred to. So the UK GBC have started to pick up NABERS ratings in their net zero carbon buildings framework. But this is part of a wider trend across the industry. We're starting to see a real move in the UK market away from energy performance certificates and BREEAM construction, which for a long time have been the centerpieces of our understanding of building performance. But over the past few years, you've seen things like UK GBC's Net Zero Carbon Buildings Framework, the REBA 2030 Climate Challenge, the LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide, of course, which are all trying to push towards operational performance, all trying to shift the conversation in the UK. And what's important to note is that they're all pushing targets which are based on in-use performance. It doesn't really matter what your rating is in terms of an EPC. You need to be actually thinking about how much energy you are really using. And it's all based on what's been called this Paris-proof target concept, which is about trying to make sure that buildings are future-proofed for a net zero carbon future. Now, this is based on a very simple concept that there will only be a finite amount of zero carbon energy available in 2050 in a zero carbon economy. And unfortunately, we can't just electrify the entire economy, switch over to renewables. There simply won't be enough. So this idea of Paris-proof is about trying to balance demand and supply, effectively not taking more than your fair share of the renewable energy that will be available. And the energy grid doesn't care about what your rating is. It cares about how much energy you are actually using. This is where this shift is coming from. We need to be looking more at how buildings are actually performing, because that's how they're going to get judged as we move towards net zero carbon. And we've seen that from UK GBC most recently in terms of their targets for offices. They have explicitly set out a 6-star NABERS rating as achieving net zero carbon for a base building. So it's a in terms of trying to achieve net zero carbon for a building today, NABERS is going to be one of the key routes through which you can actually achieve that. Now, this is all industry stuff. I have heard it played back a few times that, of course, in Australia it's regulated, so that's why everyone does it. And it's not coming in the UK. That ignores two things. Firstly, as Nick has outlined, it was starting to, NABERS really took off in Australia when it was picked up by large real estate investors. And then that growth was continued once it was picked up by government and in terms of public procurement and regulation. So it really needs an industry move to get it started, and that is what has happened in the UK. But you can also see that there are signs of this starting to get implemented into regulation in the UK. So the London Plan has new requirements which came into force last year. Be seen requirements, so major developments are required now to report on their energy use for the first 5 years of operation. And the draft supplementary planning guidance is the first policy document in the UK to explicitly mention NABERS UK as a route for complying with that be seen requirement. Now, you could undertake a display energy certificate, but why would you bother? Why wouldn't you just look at undertaking a NABERS rating so that you actually get something more useful out of it as a landlord? It's also worth looking a little bit further into the future. So the Energy White Paper, which was published at the end of last year, there was lots of focus on the announcements around minimum standards being tightened for commercial buildings to EPC B by 2030. But another announcement in there is that the government plans to consult on the introduction of mandatory operational energy ratings for commercial buildings. Now, this could be quite significant. We've been talking about it for a long time, and we don't yet know exactly what that is going to look like. But what we do know is that government officials and indeed government ministers have taken a very keen interest in the development of Design for Performance and NABERS UK. And they are getting the message that they need to introduce something which is useful for building users and operators. It can't just be a disclosure thing. So the point is, if they don't just adopt NABERS wholesale, then they are going to set up something which is going to look very, very similar. So you might as well get your house in order sooner rather than later. So I'll hand back to Nick just to talk through what that process actually looks like.
Thanks for that, Richard. So in terms of actually doing a NABERS rating, all that's required is basically the amount of energy your building uses over a year, and we get that through the utility bills, so the 12 months of utility bills. The hours of operation, so hours per week of operation, and that typically comes from lease information or BMS data, or basically anything that's accepted by the rules that demonstrates how much your building actually operates in terms of hours per week. The area of the building as well, which comes from the leased area, and then also where the building's physically located. So it's really location, size, energy use, and hours. And if you have information for that, that's essentially the fundamentals of what goes into achieving a NABERS rating. In terms of the timelines for actually undertaking a rating and how it all works, so you have a rating period, which is historic. So it's 12 months of data, so 12 months of building operation, and it's always looking backwards. So when you come to do a rating, you're in that processing point in the middle of the screen there, and you look back 12 months, you gather the 12 months of data for energy use, the leased area and the rated hours that sort of are attributable to those 12 months. You then go through the process of plugging that data into the software, dealing with the assessor. If you are the assessor, you're going through the process with your client, and you've got 120 days or 4 months to actually just do the rating for that 12-month period, that target rating period you've got. And then if you do it within that 4 months, you then have a certificate that's valid for the next 12 months. So your star rating certificate is then valid and lasts for 12 months. And then once that 12 months lapse, you just go through the process again. Basically, the 120 days is there to say, well, if you go beyond that to process your rating for your target rating period, then you can still get a certificate, but we're only going to make it valid for 12 months plus 120 days from your rating period. So if it takes a bit long, you might just have to adjust your rating period. But basically, the point of this is you're looking back 12 months, and then your rating is valid for 12 months, and then you go through the process again. So it's a sort of a 12-month cycle for NABERS, basically.
Yeah, and I think it's important here just to talk a bit about what the energy scope is, because in the UK, obviously, we're not perhaps as familiar with the concept of the landlord energy. So within the landlord energy, and the idea of the rating scheme is very much to give the landlord a rating for the things that they themselves control. So that includes common area lighting and power, obviously, lifts and escalators, any exterior lighting, signage, car parks. Importantly, all air conditioning and ventilation must be included. So that will include any fan coil unit energy, even if that's served off tenant boards. It'll include any on-floor pumping, if we have that on-floor air handling, etc. The idea is that the landlord takes control of that air conditioning energy for the purposes of the NABERS rating. And also included would be any non-office areas that are exclusively for tenant use. So if you have for example, a rooftop terrace, perhaps there's a cafe up there that's only for building tenants, that would again be included in the landlord's rating scheme. On the other hand, exclusions, things like retail energy use would be excluded, obviously tenant lighting, small power ICT, as we said, any data center style computer rooms. But the important thing to realise is that this really is a performance-based rating scheme. So it means that any exclusions must be done on submetering data, and that submetering data must be clearly identified on schematics. You must be able to validate what that submeter serves, and 10% of those meters must be validated annually to confirm that they are accurate and the data is correct. And I think that that's a really key thing to sort of reiterate in terms of next steps for the UK market. We historically perhaps haven't had such a clear delineation. And so there's a lot of instances within existing buildings where we are either going to need to add submetering in to get inclusions and exclusions to be as fair as possible, or look at how that submetering data is being handled at present and make sure that that record keeping, including those schematics, are up to date. And so I think that's a good point to sort of switch over to some case studies. Now, obviously, as Richard said, the scheme sort of launched at the very end of last year. We're looking with the BRE likely to launch the ability to achieve formal ratings later in the year. So there's no certified buildings in the UK at present. So what we wanted to share was a couple of case studies, one from London in terms of what we can do today in the UK ahead of the scheme rating, but then looking forward to Australia and what that process is going to look like in more detail moving forward. So I want to talk about this particular case study that we did for one of our clients. It was an early appraisal of NABERS UK performance, looking at 5 assets across one of their portfolios. What we found is there's potentially some issues around higher than expected energy usage, but more interestingly, there was a lot of items there around just issues of data quality and record keeping. The buildings that we looked at had absolutely fantastic submetering systems, but just over time, some of that data and the linking into schematics sort of become out of date. So there were a lot of recommendations just simply around record keeping, as well as obviously that energy management and optimization process that really helps reduce energy use and get those better ratings in operation. What I'd say, my recommendation after having gone through this process for all buildings in the UK is to really start today to look at that submetering data, look at that record keeping, because in some cases, if we need to add in submetering or if we need to put in place different or better record keeping systems, it's going to take some time to implement that. So by starting today, we're positioning ourselves to be able to be leaders in the scheme and one of the first buildings in the UK to be able to get out of the gate and get that NABERS rating. So then in terms of, I guess, talking about Australian case studies, I'll hand over to Dave to talk through some of the more detailed work that we do in Australia around the NABERS scheme.
Thanks, Jen. So as you said, I've got 3 case studies to go through today. I'm trying to highlight different areas that NABERS gets used in Australia. So the first one is a project in Melbourne. It's 140 William Street. It's a large commercial office that this was sort of back in 2011 that we started working on this project. It's a large commercial office, hadn't really had much attention to its building systems or anything like that. Was getting NABERS ratings at around the 2.5-star mark, so a pretty average performance there, and quite a lot of complaints about its systems and its use of the building. So very important from this building is that we went into the building to the first NABERS rating, 2.5 stars, not great, obviously. But then we were able to engage with the client and say, what would your desired NABERS rating be? And how can we get there? So they wanted at that time to achieve at least a 4-star rating. So we did an energy audit of the building, something that's done around the world on all types of buildings, but we were able to attribute the difference in kilowatt hours to different NABERS ratings. So we were able to work out how much it would take, what sort of modifications it would take to take the building from 2.5 stars to 4 stars. And then obviously we could put a budget to that. So things that we included was that there was a fairly terrible chilled water system. So we're able to introduce a low load chiller, which really works well in Australia in these times where it's not always hot here. It's hot sometimes, but it's not always hot. So a low load chiller to cater for those sort of mid seasons and when it's not that hot, linked with primary, secondary pumping and VSDs on all the pumps. And then we just did a lot of other simple things like BMS recommissioning, which is a good savings, car park lighting, AHU static pressure, reset control, optimum starts, and those type of things. So there was one chunky lot of money, which was in the chillers and the chilled water plant, and then everything else was fairly simple, cost-effective solutions. So out of that process, we managed to achieve the 4-star rating, which was great. The client loved that from their investors, also their tenants loved that. It cost around $900,000 Australian to make those changes, but that was paid back in just over 3 years. So it's actually a very good commercial project as well. And the main thing is that the complaints about the air conditioning system in that building dropped by over 90%. So an even better outcome for the tenants. So NABERS was the catalyst for a lot of changes in this building. Their leasing weighted average leases increased and all sorts of things for this building. So a really good success story for how NABERS as the catalyst can change the whole building dynamic and keep tenants and improve value. My next case study is on ISPT. It's a fairly simple case study, but we just want to show how large NABERS is used. So ISPT is a super fund, and it has over 18 billion in portfolio in commercial, retail, industrial assets. So that's 26 commercial properties which they rate annually under NABERS. So over 650,000 square meters of NLA. So they've been using NABERS for a long time, and their average NABERS rating now is 4.9 stars. So this is something that's at the core of their business. It's the core of how they engage facilities management. It's the core of how they decide to maintain and operate their buildings. So it's become from just a rating tool to a key part of their business model for ISPT. And the final case study I have kind of leads on from design for performance, or what we call in Australia commitment agreements, where you've got a brand new building. This is 480 Queen Street here in Brisbane. It's a 31 level premium office. This was completed in, was it 2019, I think, 2018. It was a project I worked on for a long time. Was going for a 6-star Green Star rating and a 5-star NABERS rating. We did all the energy modeling throughout the design phases. We showed that the building could perform, but the contractor that built the building was actually had commercial terms to make sure they delivered that 5-star rating. It was worth quite a lot of money in retainers on that final NABERS rating. So part of our scope of works was to look at the energy monitoring on a monthly sort of basis. So here you can see sort of 9 months of energy performance. The purple charts, the purple bars are what we're supposed to be doing. So you can see January, February, March, the red bars, which are our actual consumption, was way above. So after the first 2 months, we didn't really have much data. The EMS wasn't set up very well. Commissioning wasn't done very well. We started to get some data. Our spreadsheet started to light up with flashing lights because it wasn't working properly. A couple of $1 million retainer was on the line. So this got a lot of attention very quickly. So we were drilling into the data. We could see that it was coming from the HVAC systems. And then the more we drilled in, we could see it was coming to the chillers. So the chillers were just performing way above what we predicted them to do, which was obviously concerning for everyone. And it turns out in this building, it's got chilled beams. In Brisbane, it's quite humid. So there's always this underlying risk of condensation with those mix of climate and system. So the mechanical contractor, in all their wisdom, decided to lower the off-coil temperatures by quite a bit to try and reduce any risk of condensation in the actual chilled beams on the floor, to reduce that temperature down, reduce that risk. So what that was doing is dehumidifying the air, which was great from a risk point of view, but it was also causing us to really get cold water, and then we'd have to reheat it with the boilers. So we're getting smashed energy-wise and just a waste of energy. So that was found out in about March, and you can see the results from April onwards that we were able to keep a much better performance going for that building, and it was able to achieve its 5-star rating. Retainers were paid, everyone walked away mostly happy. So a great success story, and that building is actually performing a lot better than its 5-star now as well, once some extra tuning was done to make sure all the systems were happy. So yeah, that's some good examples of how NABERS is used in Australia. It really has changed the industry. I think for Nick and I, it's been a big part of the work we do on a day-to-day basis. It's a real core part of our work, and we think it's a great tool, so get involved. I'm going to hand back to Jen now just for a wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And I think that's exactly the key message to emphasise, that this is a real game changer for the UK industry, and it's important that we get ready for it today. So in terms of those next steps, I think really to emphasise, for new buildings, it's key to embed the design for performance process in asset design, in leasing, in the main contract and in handover. Make sure that buildings are ready to be able to be rated by NABERS UK, that we've got the building set up and the system set up to be able to do that for all new buildings. But for existing buildings, I think it's really important to start today and review performance against that NABERS UK scale. So that's looking at those sub-metering systems, looking at that record keeping, and making sure that the energy consumption is where it needs to be to enable the rating that we can get to be as high as it possibly can be, to really set the building apart as a leader within the market in the UK. And really just to emphasise that some of the items that we're going to need to deal with in buildings in the UK are going to take some time to resolve, be that adding sub-metering systems or making modifications to the building. So it's important to start today, even though the scheme hasn't fully launched yet and we're not able to get NABERS ratings yet. It's important to start today to be able to be ready for when that scheme comes together. And obviously, between myself, between Simon, between Richard, we're happy to answer any queries and help you out to do so. And then I just want to put a quick plug here for some of our upcoming Cundall webinars, looking at improving visitor experience and making buildings more welcoming. I think is going to be really key for everybody on the call. But then we've got a lot of other sort of upcoming webinars and items that we can get involved in, including things like Earth Day and looking at sort of dark sky or Martin's Law and everything. So follow up with us, get involved and hear more about what we can do as an industry. Great. So we'll hand over to Q&A now. Hopefully we've all come back on Zoom. And do we have any questions coming through?
Yes, we have had quite a few questions through actually. So one of the first ones I have here is, are NABERS ratings available for any other building types? Dave, did you want to take that one?
Sure thing. So in the UK, I believe it is just office-based buildings, but in Australia, the tool has been developed over time that it now has office-based buildings, tenancies, and whole buildings. Plus, we can do hotels, shopping centres, data centres, and there's pilot tools underway for aged care facilities, industrial centres, and one other that slipped my mind right now.
Great, thank you. We have a question here, which I think we touched upon during the presentation, but it's, are the ratings moderated for building use type, the number of people that use the building, and if the building is used on a 5 or 7 day basis? Nick, did you want to take that one?
I can do. So the key thing to note here is that you're looking at hours of operation per week. So it sort of comes down to, you need evidence to demonstrate when the building starts and when it stops and which days of the week it starts and stops, and that's all the background that sort of affects hours. Occupancy is driven by the area. So when you talk about area, it's occupied area, so it's leased area. So when an area is leased, you're sort of assuming it's occupied. So you have hours per week and occupied area or leased area, and that sort of, I guess, accounts for sort of how big the building is, how occupied it is, and how much it operates.
Perfect, thank you. We have one here from Patrick, which is good morning/evening. I'm an energy and sustainability manager at a university. How would NABERS benefit us to adopt ahead of the DEC system in our existing campus and the new building projects we'll be undertaking? Jen?
Yeah, so the key benefit of NABERS over the DEC, over the DEC, is that you're able to separate what in a commercial office building would be the landlord energy from the tenant energy. Now, depending on how the campus is operated, I would perhaps suggest that it's more likely to be sort of a single owner-occupied building, in which case the DEC does offer the benefit of being a whole building sort of rating scheme. The benefit of moving towards a NABERS scheme is that you're able to completely separate what the occupier, what the tenant is doing from what the main air handling systems, what the air conditioning systems, and what that landlord energy is doing. So I think the benefit is definitely within a university campus, in the office buildings within that campus, separating out what is occupant behaviour from what is more of a landlord-based systems issue. But at the same time, the whole building DEC is also a great way to benchmark performance for the owner-operated sort of campus-style buildings.
Perfect. So the next one here is from Fabian. So are there average costs per square metre or square feet known for doing those steps for existing buildings? Richard?
I think the guys from Australia might have a better idea of what the cost would be.
I don't think there's any direct sort of costs. We've had buildings that we've been able to improve like 1.5 star just through operational measures. So you can have very, very low costs and big improvements. Some buildings, their problems are inherent in the way the chilled water system or the air handling units are set up. We have sort of different systems to the UK, but sometimes they're so inherent in the building design, it does take a lot to change that. And that's where you kind of plan to refurbish at end of life of systems and things like that. So we work a lot on how do we actually make these changes within the budget. So if you do a plant audit and you know stuff's going to be end of life in 3 years, you can probably do it in 2. It's not going to affect your capital too much, and you'll get all these energy savings at the same time. So we can be smart with it. So it depends. It's not a straightforward dollars per saving kind of equation.
Right.
But just add to that you want to do your assessment at the start as well. Do an initial NABERS rating, and don't sort of be afraid to do that. Benchmark yourself, understand where you sit. It's not a sort of complicated or expensive process to do that. And then you're building the chance to sort of have the good news story of how much you've improved.
Thank you, guys. We actually have quite a few questions coming through, so I'm not sure we're going to be able to get through them all, but we'll keep going for a little bit longer. So Paul Chatwin has asked, what's the #1 fabric improvement recommendation we can give architects? And then he's put glazing, curtain walling, etc. Jen?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, emphasising what Dave and Nick has sort of shared from the Australian experience is, for an existing building to get a good NABERS rating, it isn't necessarily a case of doing a complete fabric overhaul. It doesn't need to be a complete, change out of the building to be able to improve the NABERS rating. It could be as simple as just adjusting time clocks to match occupant operation. In terms of the new buildings, reducing energy use, fabric is really key. And for my money, it's always on optimising the glazing to wall ratio and making sure that the peak load on our chilled water systems is not so high that we're forced to operate plant really inefficiently to serve those loads. So first step is always keep that glazing in check. And then once you've reduced that glazing area, it starts to become a lot more sensible and cost effective to move away from a curtain walling type solution. Moving to a traditional build or insulated sort of rain screen cladding solution can really improve and reduce heat losses as well. But for existing buildings, step one is, as Nick says, get the NABERS rating today, see where you sit, and look for those really cheap, low-hanging improvements that we can make.
Great. Another one here. So with the uptake of NABERS in the UK, I understand the initial focus is on office buildings. Do you think there will be a plan to extend to other commercial buildings such as retails and hotels in the future? Richard?
So that's still a question to be asked, to be honest. It's starting from a commercial office perspective because that's where most of the demand has come from. So it was an initiative which Design for Performance has mainly been driven by the Better Buildings Partnership, who are heavily focused around offices. I wouldn't be surprised to see some interest from their members for retail and potentially other hospitality as well. I think the idea is to try and get the process started, and so BRE are going to be the scheme administrators in the UK. I can see them having a look at how much demand there is for the offices-based building rating, but I think there will probably be other sectors that are turning around and asking for something similar, particularly given what I said earlier about the government's plans around mandatory operational ratings for commercial buildings. If there is something already set up for offices in terms of NABERS UK, I can imagine a few other sectors sniffing around and thinking, well, actually, we want to develop something which works for us as well, which is specifically about what NABERS is trying to do.
Yeah, I'll just add to that from Australia that some of the sectors have had better buy-in. I think the shopping centre sector has now had quite good buy-in, and that's, I think, mainly from a GRES point of view. They want to use it in their GRES reporting. But the shopping centre sector is quite hard to benchmark data. So you can have very different shopping centres. So comparing one with a 4-star rating to a different one with a 4-star rating can be quite hard. On the other side, hotels have had a fairly poor take-up of the scheme here because there's no real driver for the hotels to use NABERS as much. So commercial offices, it's by far the simplest. It's easy to benchmark and compare different offices, and the investor market is really set up to want to use that data well. So they probably will come like Australia did, but it probably will be, a few years away would be my guess. They'd want to get offices down pat and really cruising along first.
We have another one here from David. So is the average 3-star level updated as the national building stock improves, and how often is this reset? The guys in Australia, do you want to talk about that from your experience?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So the average isn't reset formally by NABERS. It basically works like what the industry accepts as average. So the tool was initially released to have 2.5 stars as average. But we haven't presented it, but there's published data to say that the actual average performer nowadays is about 3.9 star. So in terms of all the ratings that exist, an average performer is 3.9 star. So that sort of shows in itself the shift the industry's gone through. So 2.5 to 3.9 is average. So basically, the average building in Australia, 4 stars now, and the industry sort of accepts that and knows that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognise the power of having that fixed benchmark. Having a rating scale that doesn't move means that you can use it year on year to judge improvements. You're not changing the goalposts every so often. That stays fixed and you can improve your building.
They realised at one point that 5 stars wasn't enough. And then so they just added 5.5 and 6 stars, which was with 6 stars being 50% less energy than 5 stars. So a big jump. I think initially when it was announced, everyone was like, what? They're moving the goalposts. What are they doing? And then within weeks of announcing it, people were like, all right, let's get 6 stars. So it does change the market by adding to the top, but keeping the rest of the benchmark the same. So you can track that improvement, like Jen said.
Great. I'm going to have to apologise to lots of people because there's lots of questions that we aren't going to get to, but we will address them kind of either directly and send you some emails if you've included your name, or we can maybe send up a follow-up document when we send you a link to our YouTube channel. So I'm going to make this our last one. So this is, hi, I'm an architect and looking to understand what the benefit would be in recommending this scheme over others. Why are many of the actual operational energy loads excluded? And do you feel performance can be compared when, for example, lighting is not considered? Jen?
Yeah, so what we're looking at here is, in a commercial office context, you've often got tenants that will come into the building and install their own bespoke lighting designs, their own sort of feature lighting, just as one example. But you've also got then a lot of variability between one business to the next in terms of what their small power requirements are as a tenant. What that means for a commercial office landlord is that it's really difficult then to say, even between your own portfolio, whether one building is more efficient than another, because it could just be that you've got different types of tenants, and that if that tenant moves out and somebody else moves in, that your energy performance could change dramatically just off the back of that tenant. So by separating out the tenant loads, you're comparing your building in a much fairer way against other buildings of the same asset sector, and obviously within your own portfolio. There's a separate question there, I think, around efficiency of tenant improvements. In Australia, that's what the NABERS tenancy rating does. And in the UK, tools like the whole building deck would also pick up that impact. But it's just important that it is a fair rating scheme between commercial office landlords to really drive those performance improvements home.
Perfect. Thank you, Jen. Thank you to all our speakers this morning. That was a really good talk, really useful. And it obviously shows that people were engaged for the amount of questions that we've had. Obviously, this has been recorded and we will be putting it on YouTube. So if you want to watch it again, or if there's any of your colleagues that didn't get a chance to join this morning, they won't miss out. And as I said, any questions that we haven't got to, we will address them in a different format. So don't worry, they will get answered. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all for your interest and for so many people attending. Look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you all, and thank you to our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.